The Nazi occupation of Paris, like so much else that unfolded in France during World War II, was far more complicated and equivocal than is commonly believed. We tend to think of those 4 years as hard, but not as bad as the hell that the Nazis caused in other parts of the country. But much as Keith Lowe has shown in his masterpiece Savage Continent that, in the years after Germany's defeat in 1945, France was a site of rampant hate and violence. Ronald C. Rosbottom makes clear in When Paris Went Dark that the German occupation was a dreadful epoch for Paris, not only because the Nazis were there, but because Paris itself was involved in its own humiliation. Germany invaded and defeated France in only 6 short weeks. The news left everyone across the globe stunned. How had Europe's most admired army been brought to its knees so quickly? The intuitive reaction of many was to flee by the millions towards southern France. The vanquished French government, on the other hand, chose to respond with a unilateral armistice, which would lead to a traumatic legacy that would continue to haunt the country for decades. Signed by Adolf Hitler and France's famous commander, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the armistice divided the nation geographically into 2 large units, one occupied by Germany and one allegedly marked as free, ruled by a new regime in Vichy. But more or less, there was also a third France, sited in England and led by an indomitable Brigadier General, Charles de Gaulle. The invasion was hardly a well-oiled machine by any stretch of the imagination, but despite the German occupation authorities' internal disagreements and changing policies, one thing stayed the same. The Reich needed France's wealth to keep fighting England, and a year later, the USSR. Whether it was gold, livestock, architectural items, locomotives, horses, or munitions, nothing was off limits. With the mounting demands on the civilian population and the impending Russian war, the French reluctantly came to realize that the occupation would not be ending soon. Many Parisians were forced to contend with a challenging and perilous new normal in their daily lives. Many places had curfews in effect until 9 p.m., which made it difficult for people to go about. The demands of the German war effort took priority, and a good chunk of the food that was being produced was sent outside of the nation, leading to serious food shortages. There was a mass migration of Parisians. During 1940, it's estimated that more than 1 million Parisians headed out to the provinces. Others were forced to leave the country. A large number of French workers were deported and transferred to Germany as part of a forced labor scheme known as the Service du Travail Obligatoire. Those changes soon became obvious in French households, mostly run by women, for nearly 2 million men were in prisoner of war camps all over Europe. For those who stayed in France, basic supplies were rationed, and luxury items were almost non-existent. Bread, fat, and flour were some of the only commodities put on a rationing schedule. People would often make a trip out to the countryside in the hope of being able to buy fresh produce, and vans carrying food out of the country to Germany were sometimes ambushed by the French. Some restaurants managed to stay operational despite the shortages, but the food on their menu was limited to just what was sanctioned by the government, as well as what was available. They were only allowed to offer meat on specific days, and the items that were once thought of as basics, such as cream and coffee, were now seen as a great luxury and were rare. Necessary things like medication and fuel for the heating system were more and more difficult to come by. The unpredictability of the supply of food items led to the spread of the black market. Black markets grew up in the bars near the Champs-Élysées, where people would do business without the authorities seeing. The chaos of everyday urban activity, including pedestrians, hawkers, street minstrels and entertainers, construction work and, most importantly, the noise of traffic, was nowhere to be seen. During those years, Paris was a rather quiet city. Hitler had desired a quiet France, and with his invasion, he was more or less successful. Sometimes the quietness was fortunate for the people, as it let pleasing sounds of birds or a few strings of music reach the ears of the French people. But more than anything else, the sudden silence in such an influential capital must have been puzzling and sometimes terrifying. Police sirens were more menacing, airplane engines meant danger, and a shout or scream demanded a more nervous response. The sirens must have been especially terrifying because those who usually sounded them, the French police, were no friends to the ordinary citizens of the city. Though the French police have spent years trying to dodge their reputation as enablers, there is no doubt, now that the archives are almost all freely open, that the French forces of order were active, not reluctant collaborators with the Germans. Life was hard for everyone, but the Jewish people in the city had it the worst. Jews in Paris were forced to wear a yellow Star of David to distinguish them from other citizens. They were faced with a wide range of racist policies. They were banned from many occupations and professions, as well as barred from certain public places. It was only a matter of time before French Jews met the same fate as German and Polish Jews. They were rounded up and taken to the concentration camp at Auschwitz. But there is no way the Germans could have succeeded as well as they did in rounding up Jews if it had not been for the help of the local police forces. The Germans simply did not have enough employees to keep track of Jews, maintain data on them, organize and carry out arrests and incarcerations, or plan and carry out raids. Nor did they know as intimately the labyrinth that was the city of Paris. Ultimately, Paris did oppose the Nazis, but the impacts were minimal. The best that can be said about the resistance movement in Paris is that it put the Reich and its Vichy allies on the alert and sent a message to the world that Paris was not being held a prisoner. There are many French myths centered on this, although they're only loosely tied to the truth. The myth helped to avoid for a quarter of a century deeper evaluations of how easily France had been conquered and how feckless had been the nation's response to German power, particularly between 1940 and 1943. Finally, the myth of universal resistance was important to France's perception of itself as a beacon of light for human liberty and as an exemplary model of the bravery that was required to stand up against repulsive political ideologies. Paris in those years was a city where many young and middle-aged men were in prison, concentration camps, in hiding, or underground. So almost by default, the resistance became in significant measure a movement of the young and of women and girls, without whom the Parisian resistance, no matter its ideology, could not have been as successful as it was. It did keep the Germans and their henchmen in the police force on the alert, but there remained the ethical questions that would haunt France for decades. Which actions exactly constitute collaboration and which constitute resistance? When one travels to Paris in the modern day, it might be difficult to dream up any strong memories of the city as it was in the early 1940s. It is, as famous all over the world, the City of Light. However, it was once labeled as a darker city, gray and brown, not to mention noir, black, were required adjectives to describe the absence of ambient light. September 1st will mark 83 years since Germany invaded Poland starting World War II, and historians still debate what caused the German people to follow the Nazis into the conquest and the horrors. World War I's centennial has only just passed, and many consider that the conclusion of the war and the demands of the peace deal led directly to Nazism and World War II. Is it that easy to connect the dots? There is a link, particularly because Germans, Nazis and non-Nazis alike, really thought that Germany was fighting for its independence, if not for its very survival. But Hitler was very clear. World War II was not about former German territory assigned to Poland or about the national self-determination of Germans living outside Germany. The war was fought to set up a new racial order in which Germans were superiors and Slavs were inferiors and Jews had no place. It was a matter of building an empire in which the righteous could rule. In terms of foreign policy and morals, the Nazis weren't your typical German nationalists. They were outright revolutionaries. So, knowing what Nazis had in mind, why did people follow Hitler's regime? Most Germans didn't expect their country to lose World War I, and when people found out that its leaders had given up, they felt shocked and betrayed. The Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, stepped down from the monarchy and fled to the Netherlands. As revolutionaries fought for the control of the German capital of Berlin, a new government formed in a smaller city to the south called Weimar. Almost overnight, Germany turned into a democratic nation, which would be called the Weimar Republic. The fall of the monarchy sparked a power struggle and a rush to fill the void. There were a lot of disillusioned young people who returned to German and Austrian society after the First World War, which was billed as the war to end all wars, since their formative years were spent there. So, they brought this fighting spirit back to the streets of Germany and the political culture of Germany. Beer halls and street brawls were commonplace for German politics. For a liberal society to work and for a democracy to work, there had to be compromises. There had to be courtesy. And the start of democracy in Germany had nothing to do with it. Adolf Hitler was one of the new generation of German democratic experimenters who brought a combative spirit back to the experiment. Hitler was an Austrian citizen who had volunteered to fight for the German army. And like hundreds of thousands of other Germans in 1919, some of whom were in the army, some of whom were not, Hitler was troubled by the nation's loss and deeply disturbed by the political revolutions that happened at the same time and was looking for answers. And he found them in a political organization that already existed called the German Workers' Party. And because of his gift for public speaking, he quickly rose to fame in the movement. Early on in the year 1920, the party went through a name change, being known from that point on as the National Socialist German Workers Party, or the Nazi Party for short. It was a movement that offered Hitler an explanation for Germany's defeat, namely that the nation had been sold out. That it was not his fault as a former soldier that Germany had lost, but rather seditious forces at home had undercut the war effort. For boiling blood youth, that made sense of why Germany had lost. It ended up being the most important part of Hitler's discourses. And then, attached to that, was a particular statement that among those seditious forces were the Jews. Traitors have betrayed us, that's why we lost the war. You need a scapegoat for that. The Jews were a scapegoat. And Hitler carried that notion all over the nation. This was the start of Hitler laying the blame for his disgrace on his rivals in the political sphere. And then, from 1918 until 1923, Weimar was racked by a period of instability that saw hyperinflation at its height. During the Great Inflation of 1923, a loaf of bread cost thousands of marks, which meant that it was elusive for most people. It was a waste of time to go to work, since the worth of your money perished every hour of every day. That's when things went downhill. Hitler's effort to grab power in November 1923 during the height of hyperinflation was no accident. This offered him a perfect opportunity. That Weimar had gotten so chaotic, the downward spiral had gone so far, that the beer hall putsch became inevitable. Hitler and about 2,000 of his supporters tried to take over Munich by staging a coup. It ended in a fight that claimed the lives of 16 Nazis and 4 German police officers. 2 days after that, Hitler was arrested and charged with treason. The coup attempt was a failure. He then was sentenced to jail. Instead of being treated harshly or being imprisoned for lengthy periods, he was treated like a celebrity in prison. In prison, Hitler penned his master plan, Mein Kampf, translated as My Struggle. During his time in jail, Hitler made a point how successful propaganda can be, and he used that knowledge to win over the German people when he was released. Protests were organized to instill patriotism among Germans, and he founded a daily newspaper in 1925 with the help of the notorious Joseph Goebbels. It was a good time to be the Weimar Republic in the mid-1920s. Both the unemployment and inflation rates dropped. There was a sense that Germans would be able to go on with a degree of stability and prosperity. But then followed the stock market collapse of 1929, and that was the beginning of the economic disaster. Germany was in a gloomy atmosphere from 1930 to 1933. The country was hit hard by the worldwide economic depression, and millions of people were out of work. As the jobless grew in number, so did the millions of others who saw the depression as a direct effect of Germany's humiliation in World War I. Many Germans thought that the coalition government was weak and couldn't fix the economic crisis. Widespread discontent with the government's handling of the financial crisis, as well as a sense of impending doom and rage at the government's seeming incompetence, offered breeding soil for Hitler's final rise. For Hitler, the master speech giver, the long-awaited opportunity to let loose his talents on the German people had arrived. These downtrodden masses would make a sympathetic audience for him. Throughout his speeches, Adolf Hitler gave the German people the comfort they needed most. He made them a ton of hazy promises while skirting the specifics of the situation. He would use the catchphrases that were easy to remember and then repeat them often. His campaign appearances were carefully staged. Audiences were always kept waiting, deliberately letting the tension increase, only to be broken by solemn processions of brown shirts with gold banners, blaring military music, and finally the appearance of Hitler amid shouts of Heil in a small, dark room with theatrical lighting and swastika decor. The effect was overpowering and very eye-catching. Hitler was a strong and captivating speaker who got a lot of people to follow and vote for him by arousing their anger and feeling of helplessness, which made a lot of Germans who wanted change to join his cause. The Nazis swore to lift Germany out of the Great Depression with their election campaign, restore German cultural values, overturn the Treaty of Versailles, fight the fear danger of a communist revolt, bring the German people back to work, and restore Germany's quote-unquote rightful place as a global power. Hitler and other Nazi propagandists were very good at turning people's anger and fear against Jews, Marxists, and those the Nazis blamed for signing the armistice of November 1918, the Treaty of Versailles, and making Germany a parliamentary republic. Hitler and the Nazis often referred to them as November criminals. Every one of Hitler's and Nazi speakers' speeches was meticulously crafted to fit the specific audience. For instance, when speaking to businessmen, the Nazis downplayed anti-Semitism and instead emphasized anti-communism and the return of German colonies lost through the Treaty of Versailles. When speaking to soldiers, veterans, or other nationalist groups, Nazi propaganda centered on building up the military and getting back other territories that had been lost to the Treaty of Versailles. Farmers in the northern state of Schleswig-Holstein were promised by Nazi speakers that a Nazi administration would keep agricultural prices stable. Pensioners all around Germany were promised that their monthly checks would stay consistent in terms of both amount and purchase power. He had a broad base of support among Germans of various socioeconomic backgrounds. The name of the Nazi Party itself was deliberately all-inclusive: the National Socialist German Workers Party. Every single member of the Nazi Party, starting with Hitler and going all the way down to the chairman of the tiniest city block, toiled at day and night to hammer their ideology into the heads of the German people. On September 14, 1930, the day of the election, the Nazis got 6,371,000 votes, which was over 18% of the total. This gave them the right to 107 seats in the German Reichstag. Hitler was able to pull off a spectacular win. The Nazi Party moved from being Germany's smallest political party to becoming its second largest in what seemed to be overnight. It elevated Hitler to a position of national and worldwide fame and piqued the interest of the foreign media. He was swamped with demands for an interview. Journalists from other countries were curious as to what he meant when he said Germany wasn't to blame for the First World War and that the Treaty of Versailles should be torn up and that war reparations should stop. Gone was the Charlie Chaplin image of Hitler as the laughable fanatic behind the beer hall putsch. The beer hall revolutionary had been replaced by the skilled manipulator of the masses. On October 13, 1930, wearing brown shirts, the elected Nazi MPs entered the Reichstag in unison and took their seats. When it came time to take roll, everyone shouted with a roar, "Present, Heil Hitler." They had no intention of collaborating with the Democratic administration, knowing that leaving things to worsen in Germany would increase Hitler's appeal to an increasingly depressed public. German citizen stormtroopers celebrated their political triumph by shattering the windows of Jewish businesses and department stores, a hint of what was to come. Now, the clock was ticking for the dying German democracy, and Hitler had time on his side.